moon excited to talk to Angela Ross today, a genetic counselor. And I'm going to let you introduce yourself and tell us about yourself and your history. And then we're going to dive into genetics and what that means and how your genetic history and your family history can indicate your risk for, we'll specifically talk about cancers and women's cancers, but I think we'll probably sort of, I don't know, our tentacles will reach into other places, but just give us your background. Obviously, your sort of the medical side of it. And then really, will you just tell us why you got into this and why this is where you've decided to spend your life's work?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'll never forget it, actually. So I grew up in Australia, hence my accent, and I was studying for my Bachelor of Science in Melbourne, Australia. And then I remember it was the second year into the course, the professor of the Murdoch Institute, as in the Murdochs, he came to speak about genetic counseling. And I'm like, I love science. I love people, interacting with people. This sounds amazing. So that then sort of got me on my job career path. And so then I subsequently did the graduate diploma over there. I'm aging myself because they didn't have a master's back then. and then came over here and did my degree at Sarah Lawrence College. Then I got to work over in the UK for a while in genetics, and I used to work in like prenatal and pediatric, but everything has kind of led towards cancer predisposition. So I've got, and I feel like almost fate in a way. It has led me to where I am now. So it's been an amazing experience, and I get to do what I love doing, is sort of mixing science with interacting with people, which I love.
Absolutely. Tell us the real importance of a genetic counselor and what that means, especially for women when talking about what genetic testing and how a genetic counselor needs to be side by side.
Yeah. So things are changing in the science and the testing realm, where it used to be very, paternalistic, very regimented in genetic counseling. You know, you'd need to meet with a genetic counselor pre-test. You'd then test, and you probably would not get the results outside of meeting with a genetic counselor for a second time. But things are now changing. You can get direct-to-consumer testing. You can get other sorts of genetic testing. And genetic testing doesn't just mean a blood test for predispositions. It could be like a tumor test, right? Genetic testing could be a direct-to-consumer health test, not necessarily a genetic test, which is what I like for testing for the mutations in BRCA genes. Mm-hmm. So the importance of genetic counselors, especially now, is that people are having genetic testing outside of having pre-test counseling for whatever reason, and they're not necessarily getting the information they need to sort of understand their reports. They get access to their reports, and we can support these patients in sort of expanding the family history, make sure they've had the correct testing or give the correct testing per the assessment. And then they've also then got us as a resource or as a support for them going forward if something's positive and we need to manage their risk and send them to other professionals, or even if they're negative and they have updates to family histories in the future, things like that. So we're a very good support service, but I really just think we're needed now because non-genetics professionals can order testing, and it's going to happen. We can't stop that from happening. And, a lot of patients sort of would benefit from the pre-test counselling, but that's probably almost going away now. But I want people to be aware that there's availability for professionals to talk to you about post-test answers. Even if you get a report and it's negative, but I actually had that recently. They're like, I just came to see you because I think it's negative, but is it? Because they're getting these lab reports now and they're not sure how to interpret them themselves. So I feel like we've got the expertise to review these with patients as well.
Okay, so let's take a step back. So there's a couple different avenues I want to go down with you. The first being these sort of tests that you can order online. So, without naming names, the ones where you can see all the different genetics that you carry and what mutations you might have and what they might lead to. And, there's sort of a spattering of information that you spit into a vial or give your hair, and then you find out all this sort of information.
Yeah. You're at risk for diabetes by 2% or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And who are you? And, where do you come from? That you can find that out. And then what does that mean? What's the point? And in addition, what kind of genes do you have, and are there mutations? And that in itself is a very scary word. I think when my kids hear it, they think of one of those Marvel movies where they're going to like turn green at age something,
Yeah.
or spout spider veins they can crawl
Yep.
walls. So what are your thoughts on those kinds of tests in general? Good, bad, ugly, I don't know. Or maybe they're neither, they just are. And if they're
Yep.
out there, you've touched on, and we've talked about doing those tests alongside some sort of counseling. But what do they mean for an average human? What do they mean for doing them, and what kind of information are you meant to gather from them? And then what do you do with it? Let's, like, if you are negative, what does that
Mhm.
even mean? Negative for
Yep.
what? And
Yep.
what do you do with that? Negative for celiac? Okay, so then you eat bread.
Yeah.
Like, let's dig into that a little bit
Yeah.
more.
No, I love that you're asking that question because it's the future of genetic testing. Is genetic testing out there, even outside the cancer realm? Is genetic testing. So we all have 2 copies of every gene, one from our mum and one from our dad, and we've sequenced the genome. Yay! But we don't know what every gene does. So we've sort of got the reference human sequence out there, and then we now can do some genetic testing to see and compare and contrast your sample with the normal, I guess, human, this what it's meant to be. And we're all going to have changes in our DNA that don't mean anything. And we might have mutations that do present with something. But we're all different, right? So someone who's of Asian descent, Black descent, white descent, Indian, you're going to have different changes, but it doesn't mean it affects the gene or what it does. So you have to be very careful when you're reading these reports, whether it's a real variant that's going to do something or could predispose, or if it's just what we call a benign polymorphism. So if you go broad with some of these tests that they do, I think at some of these direct-to-consumer health tests, so I'm going to get to that in a second, you've got to be careful about what data you're getting and exactly what are you going to do with it? What are you doing it for? So there's direct-to-consumer, like for health, right? So there are these labs that are advertising. You could see if you've got slow twitch fibers or something for running, and if you're healthy for this, or what you said, if you're at risk for diabetes. And they gather that information, and whatever they report. And I'm not a physician, so I actually don't know how to interpret a lot of those, and I don't know what the use is or how someone will use that to their benefit. But people are doing it, right? And then you have labs that do either a mix of that with ancestry, or just do ancestry. So there's ancestry tests out there which people are finding very helpful and useful just for family history. It's very interesting. But the genetic tests that are also available when it comes to familial things and familial risks, and it's not just in the adult world, it could be pediatrics or prenatal, where people are offered genetic testing to see if they have a genetic change, a variant, a mutation that is going to present with something in the future, or is it you're predisposed to something? And then what do you do with that information? And then there's tumor genetic testing now, where patients who actually have cancer often will have a tumor profile done looking at their genes, and that's more ordered by the doctors to direct treatment options, possibly to see if someone's had cancer that's recurred or metastasized, or are they likely to respond well to certain chemotherapies. So that test is often ordered by physicians in the treating realm, but then it overlaps with genetics because when they're doing the testing, they don't filter out what is the familial gene mutation. So they're basically taking some tissue that's cancerous, looking at the gene, if there's gene mutations, right? So they're looking at basically every single cell of your body. So they might report a gene in a mutation in gene XYZ, which is seen in breast cancer patients, but that a mutation in BRCA1 in that tumor is not familial. It's tumor, and it was part of the tumor development. But they don't report that. They don't know because they're not reporting about that. They're reporting about what the tumor looks like. So they don't tell you if the mutation is in BRCA1 or BRCA2 in this particular report, or what's another one, APC or other genes. They report all the mutations in the genes, but people sometimes get panicked and go, oh, I've got a BRCA1 mutation, but you've got to look. This is where we can guide you, because you've got to see, well, does that test split up? Whether that is a genetic mutation that is germline, in other words, familial, or is it just part of the tumor development? just in the tumor. And that's where you have to determine that. So it's getting very complex these days, reviewing these reports.
And the more we know, the less we know. So the more we know, the more information I feel like we're finding out.
Knowledge is power. Yep.
Yeah. So I feel like the more we know, the more that we're finding out. And what I want to do is take a step back, and let's assume that some people don't know all of the names and initials we're throwing out there, right? And so this helps a lot when we're talking about cancer and genetic mutations. So let's talk about BRCA, and then a lot of those are the most well-known, BRCA1, BRCA2, and a bunch of the other genetic mutations that we do know about. So will you just give us sort of a cheat sheet on those and what they mean and what they indicate for women in particular?
Now that the technology's gotten better, we've identified many genes linked with familial risk for cancer. And I'll start talking more cancer versus other things, just so that we're focused on the topic. And then again, the genes that we're discovering, it's not just BRCA1 and 2 anymore. There are other genes that have been identified that predispose to breast, ovarian, and other cancers, and they're gene-dependent risks. And so I guess we're smarter, the technology's gotten better, and the testing can be quicker as well, but it's a lot of information. And some people are knowledge is power. And I do actually believe that now. And things have changed in our area where as I said, we were paternalistic, kept it very close. Are you okay with this result? Which we still do now. But then instead of sort of giving people the option to opt out of testing or looking for mutations in genes that we can manage their risk, we're more sort of let's look, this is good information for you to know. They can still opt out of certain testing, absolutely, but that's where the discussion comes into play. Do you want to know if you're at risk for, a syndrome called Li-Fraumeni syndrome, which is a mutation in a TP53 gene, which is actually very commonly mutated in lots of tumors, and it's not familial. So there's so much to understand, and without slides it's hard because I can give you the names of genes, but the main ones that we think about now with ovarian cancer would be BRCA1 that a lot of people have heard about, BRCA2, PALB2, RAD51C, RAD51D. We're looking at ATM. And then, there are other genes that are going to be identified that provide risks, not certainty, risk for developing cancer over someone's lifetime. And it's not 100% most of the time, but it's a risk. And then how do you manage that risk? But importantly, what I'd like to say, if you'd like to include this in, Ian, is I also think the lingo between patient and doctor or healthcare professional, people should be aware of the way information is presented. Because I have had genetic testing can mean many things. Like you could have had a tumor profile testing done. Patients don't realize they haven't had a proper clinical familial test. Like the data's in there, but you have to take it out. I've had genetic testing. They send I won't use names of companies from an ancestry place, right? Or a healthcare gene test. That's genetic testing, right? So you need to understand that there are different tests and you may not have had the right test for you, and we need to just at least inform patients what they've had and explain it because it's complicated. I mean, people don't do this all the time like we do, so it's not surprising. And then the other thing that is something that doesn't help on television is when they say, I've got the BRCA gene, right? And I've got the BRCA1. Everyone has BRCA1 genes, BRCA2 genes, as I said, one from mum, one from dad. But what people are talking about when they're talking about risk and management, it's whether you have a mutation or a change in those genes that you've inherited from your mother or your father that predispose you to risk. So I'd love to get these television programs to get someone to consult with them and say, just make it a bit clearer what you're talking about, because it's just good, better understanding, I think, of what's going on. It's just a minor thing, but it's important to know that there can be changes in genes that you could identify that are inconclusive. They're called variants of uncertain significance. And that's another reason often people are sent to us now post-test, because the people who order the test don't understand what it means, and we've got the resources and the knowledge to tease it out. Take the family history. Is it significant? What does it look like? Things like that. And to your point about a negative test, and I think we spoke about this when we first sort of met over the phone, is even a negative test, while it can be great news to families, if you've got a really strong family history, there may still be recommendations to do certain things to manage risk, because we don't know everything. And if there's a striking family history of, say, we'll talk about female ovarian and breast cancer in families, like striking to the point where we're like, I can't believe we didn't identify something, you're going to be provided high risk recommendations regardless. And you don't want to miss those people and say, yes, I'm negative, which is, again, is great. But you want to make sure the right person was tested, because if someone in the family hasn't had cancer, but their mother passed away of breast cancer at 30 and they did a test and it was negative, we don't know that mum had a mutation to begin with and what that was. And if you're negative because you were going to be negative because mum didn't have a mutation, or it's a 50-50 chance you would be negative anyway. So it's all about context and assessment, and it all pulls together. So I guess the summary really would be a genetic counselor or genetic professional provides a cancer risk assessment based on a detailed family history. And we do like patients, I know they push back a lot sometimes because it is, depending on family dynamics, it's hard to get, but know your family history, try and get ages of diagnoses, try and confirm the cancers in the family. Like, something that's very striking is if, a cousin had ovarian cancer at 45, but then you say, could you get a pathology report and it was cervical cancer, not taking away the diagnosis of and the impact of cancer at all, but from a risk assessment, that takes that concern off the table, right? And that can be more reassuring to someone. And then also confirming all cancers is always helpful, but we can't always get that, so we deal with what we can. But family histories are important. So if anyone is asked to complete a questionnaire, please do, because it really helps us determine whether insurance will cover testing, what you might need, and then we'll always talk to you as well and gather information as time goes on. And then after the genetic risk assessment, we either test or review testing that's been done, make sure the testing is complete. Say someone comes to me and they had testing back in 2005. I'll be like, oh, you have to, depending on the family history, most likely, please update your testing. And so we need to know the dates of these reports. So get copies of these reports just to see, because years ago it was just the Jewish panel, the BRCA1 and 2 Ashkenazi Jewish panel. There are 3 mutations in BRCA1 and 2, just in case people aren't aware. There's 2 changes in the gene in BRCA1 and there's 1 in BRCA2. And it's more prevalent in the people of Eastern European, Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. So those were the 3, because they were sort of more common, they were the ones that were kind of researched first. But then we've obviously expanded and we have many people, everyone's at risk, unfortunately, for BRCA mutations, but we've got a lot of data and research on the BRCA genes now, and we can manage people's risk, and it's very personal. It's very individual discussions that we have. We try not to just put people in a box if we can avoid it, but there's a lot more positivity in respect to, if you developed cancer, is there a targeted drug that could help you? There's these targeted therapies now that are proving to be great. God forbid you get cancer. It can lead to cascade testing for family members, and we sort of can help coordinate these for family members. We can either recommend a genetic counsellor. We've got the National Society of Genetic Counselling has a Find a Counsellor link. So if you're not, I like to see my families when possible, but if someone lives in San Francisco or in LA, then they can meet with a local genetic counsellor and get someone to look at it properly who's seen your reports before. And just to be aware that there are other genes now. And so if anyone who's listening to this had testing back in 2005, 2015, never hurts to review the report and just see if things have updated or if anything's changed in the family history, just to see if there's change in recommendations.
Yeah. So walk me through it a little bit more in depth. So let's say a woman like myself, my mom was diagnosed with ovarian cancer at 48 years old. She passed away at 53. She tested negative this was 1998 when she died, 1993 when she was diagnosed. So her testing was done I mean, mid 90s. I don't know exactly when. And I don't know what she was tested for, to be
Right.
honest. I mean, we were always told she was negative for a BRCA mutation. What would you, and I know what I've done, but let's assume
Yeah.
I've done
Yeah.
nothing. What would you recommend for me and my two sisters? My older sister, we're all of the same mother, but my older sister has a different father. In 25 years later, in 2023, let's say we had testing done,
Yeah, let's
early
do the
2000s.
the update discussion. So in the genes were discovered in about 93, 94. And I know that, again, we were offering the Ashkenazi Jewish panel, which I think you guys
Which
have
we are, yes.
in Europe. So it's most likely your mum had definitely had that testing.
Mhm.
And that might, if it was that long ago, that might have been the only testing she'd done. And back then, I don't know if they were doing additional testing because we've learned so much more information. So if you came to me with that family history and that information, I would try and get a report to see what was done, but recommend update testing via a more expansive panel, that includes breast ovarian cancers as it pertains to the rest of the family history. And depending on family history, sometimes we add on random genes because you've told me someone had ocular cancer, which there's a gene called BAP1, very rare, but I've picked someone up on that in a family history. So we're able to do that risk assessment. So the
What
main
is ocular cancer related?
ocular melanoma, melanoma, cancer in the eye.
But that's not unrelated to a breast, to an ovarian.
No, unrelated to ovarian. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. But what I'm saying is if you saw me and I took a family history and we said, we'll definitely have to update the BRCA, make sure you've had complete screening.
Right.
And do the rest of the breast ovarian genes as it pertains to the risk because of your mum.
Yeah.
But it's not just ovarian. There could be other things in the family that might lead us to adding or changing the testing that some people are going to be missed if they're not, if they're testing maybe at other places, or maybe not, because a lot of these panels now have pretty much every gene, and there's genes I haven't even heard of in some of them. Yeah. But definitely update the testing and make sure that there isn't a gene that's been missed that could be important to determine in the family. And that's probably not going to happen often. But I've definitely had families come back and they've had like a BRCA1 mutation and then a TP53 mutation in the family, which is what? That Li-Fraumeni syndrome, which can involve breast cancer, not ovarian cancer much, but more very early breast cancer, leukemias, lymphomas, brain cancers. It's a very tough syndrome, but we now have management strategies for patients with this syndrome. So we manage those risks and guide them to the best, direct them to the best doctors or services that they need to do to reduce their risk of developing cancer.
And what is your take on sort of a preemptive strike with genetics and finding mutations in your body, as opposed to learning about your family history and knowing and looking into it and saying, oh, I think I'm at risk for this because my mother passed away young, or, I have 4 grandmothers or 4 grandfathers that all had testicular cancer, as opposed to, I have no idea what my family history is. I don't care. I'm not going to bother with that. I just want to know everything that could possibly happen in my body. And I want to figure it out at 22 years old and then know everything. What's your, as a counselor, what's your take on that?
That's a really, really good question because, again, back to aging myself, back in the day, we were very strict about not testing young people for BRCA1 mutations, teens or 20s, if there wasn't a family history, because, that was scary. They're young. There was a lot of very rules around testing for mutations and if you didn't know about it. But now, and also, we would only really recommend testing an affected family member. So we probably wouldn't have tested you, Amy, if you came to us. If your mum was with us, we wouldn't have tested you and tested her because that gives you context. Because if you're testing the person in the family with a young cancer with a particular gene, say BRCA or 1 or 2 or another mutation in one of those genes, you get a better assessment. Because if they're negative, then you're likely to be negative and maybe there's something else going on, but we haven't identified it yet. But it's sort of gone away from that now where we do test unaffected family members. I mean, we recommend to test family members that are affected if possible, because again, if you've got a negative test, there could still be a mutation and you didn't inherit it. So the luxury, so to speak, of genetic counselors being able to hold back results and share them, especially with the younger ones that I do see, patients have been tested at 19 for BRCA1 and ATM mutation that was totally unnecessary. But, it happens. It's going to happen. So then it's a case of making sure they've got the right resources. They're ready to hear the results. Who can they be in with? We can't really stop that anymore. There's also the CARE Act that's just come. I don't know if you heard of the CARE Act that just sort of came into play, where now the ability for us holding back results is now not possible. So you as soon as results are signed out, you'll get them at the same time as your doctor. So I've started preparing patients for that, just to know I have no control. If you want to open them, do, and then call me, or you contract with them to see how they want their results. They're adults, most of them, so it's like it's up to them. And I've had patients who said, no, I want to speak to you. We'll open them together, or and that's just the way sort of it is. But it depends on the context. But testing a 20-year-old who doesn't know anything about the family, not adopted, like say there's got a lot of family members, but is 20 and just is very anxious and wants to have a genetic panel run for cancer or for whatever reasons, I mean, they can get it. They should sort of speak to a genetic counselor first to get context and understand why we wouldn't necessarily recommend that, because there's the risk of uncertain variants that we don't do anything with. And that may pay, if they're so worried at 20 for something that isn't really indicated, that might not be good for them, right? And then if there's a gene-associated risk, if it comes up at 50, their risk, and they're 20, there's nothing that we're going to do for them until at least 30, for example. But we're not going to, we listen to patients. We don't sort of deny patients care or testing. And in fact, I've gone to the point where, look, insurance isn't going to cover it. We consider this low risk. You can get testing. If the doctor that I'm working with agrees, we could try and get it covered by insurance, but it's probably not going to be covered. Or you can find a direct-to-consumer lab that is a good lab, and we do have names of some, but I won't use them, that do clinical germline familial testing for cancer predisposition genes. I know one has a panel of over 60 genes on there, so a lot of those genes are not relevant, but some of them will be. And then the results will come back, and then they can meet with the genetic counselor and review them. Either they've self-paid, because cheaper, like $250 now to do some of these tests, especially if it's not covered by insurance. And, I think we have to embrace that. And I want to be there for patients who get these tests outside, because it is all about interpretation and looking at the family history. And if we have patients who are adopted and develop cancer, and we have to kind of just wing it, and sort of see what we should be doing. So, but, the important thing also is most cancer is not familial. Most cancer does occur by chance. But I know with your family and, if you see young cancers and multiple family members, it never hurts to meet with a genetic counselor or specialist to get a view or a take on it and to give you perspective of what it means or what they might.
Absolutely. And you're going to make these huge decisions based on this idea of a potential mutation in your body. And I mean, men and women, and speaking for women, if you find out you're at a significantly increased risk for ovarian cancer, breast cancer. I mean, I have had women in their, before they've decided they're single in their 20s and, they want to get married or they want to have kids, and they, are talking about major surgeries to, take away my ovaries before I get ovarian cancer. And it's, these are life-changing decisions, and
they're real, and they're like, you can't take away. I always say, look, I'm talking to you clinically, but I can't take away your anxiety that your mother passed it or was diagnosed at 45, because I bet at that age, when you got at that age, that was a scary time for you, because it's family and family history. And we try and, let them know what their options are and what's realistic and what isn't, and send them on to the right physicians to make those decisions. Do they want to have a mastectomy in their 20s? Depending on the family, is it unreasonable or reasonable, whatever they want to do, but they can't breastfeed. There's things about that have to be talked about. But if their mother had ovarian cancer at 30, for goodness sake, which is very rare, but can happen, I don't blame it if someone young wants to consider what can they do. And we probably wouldn't take up the ovaries, but you could consider the fallopian tubes or something. But meet with a specialist who would talk them through those sort of concerns, because I think immediately you get all anxious and worried, which is absolutely fine, normal, but it's all about getting things into perspective and understanding that even though we might say, oh, you're negative, you don't have a mutation, but mum had ovarian, I would like my ovaries out anyway. There's so many things that can come into the discussion that we have to take into account the individual discussion. It's not just Okay, you're negative, great. Don't worry about it. It's not that anymore. It's sort of we
No, definitely
like to
not.
speak to people about, how they feel about it, and it's okay to feel like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think going through it without a genetic counselor is just, I mean, it's just torturous. It's just horrible. I just don't,
Yeah.
it just kills me that people do that. And so many people don't know it's an option.
Yeah, it's hard to understand because I do it all the time, and sometimes I'm thinking, oh, people know about this. I'm like, no, no, no. This is why I'm speaking to people, is because because in different areas have different accesses to different resources, right? And so there are areas in the country that don't have genetic counselors very close. But now we've got remote genetic counselors. There's companies that do remote phone calls. Some of the labs do provide genetic counseling on the phone if you do a direct to consumer. A lot of the time that happens, but then they like to come to in person to meet with someone at a cancer hospital or a cancer genetic center to get more clarity, or to get a real family history done. Because the thing that's again, have to embrace these panels and genetic testing and the way things are going. But you've got to be aware that they're kind of fishing if you're offering a big panel from a lab that that someone's come and, from a certain lab, great labs, but come and advertise their services. And someone says, oh, you've got a family history. Let's do this panel. And then it's a panel they just decide to do the whole kit and caboodle, the whole panel of 80 genes, for example, and then with no sort of understanding that there could be something inconclusive. Half the genes don't mean anything, but, they have it in the just have it, and the results come back, and then the doctor says, oh, I don't know what to do, go to genetics, and look, it's going to happen that way, but we are there for you people, for you guys out there, if you need us at all, because I'm advocating for patients. I want to make sure they understand what's going on, and it is the future. It's their right if they want to go and have these tests, but it's all about context, I guess. And I just get so worried that people are going to miss something, like, if they don't take a strong family history and there's not a gene that's been added, and but that's my anxiety a little bit sometimes, because patients are pretty cool with genetics now, but it's the ones that with the positive results or the inconclusive results that obviously get alarmed, and it takes a lot of time to get into genetics now, unaffected sometimes, to get in to see a genetic counsellor. So that's just adding to the anxiety, is waiting to meet with someone after the fact as well.
And like we said, there's the more information that we find, the more we find. And so it's a lot. And, I've been in rooms with very highly educated people who, don't know what we're talking about. And, it doesn't mean that they're not knowledgeable. That's just, this is not their sphere of it, knowledge. So they don't know what we're talking about. And so they need to, learn about it and to understand. And also family history in itself is very tricky, and not everyone is forthright with their own bodies and what they experienced, or talking to their children about it. So, or the way it's documented, so you can have great grandparents who died of something, but, who knows what that was, something in their stomach, or, the way it was passed down orally through the generations.
Yeah.
And so it's very hard to know, and it's very hard to remember, and it's very hard to say.
And people don't, it's family dynamics, right? Oh, I don't speak to my sister. I don't want to ask, and so I do try to encourage patients to find out as much as possible, but look, don't stress, but it is going to help us at the end of the day. But there's so many complex things. And I don't know how many of non-genetics doctors who are ordering these big panels, how much of a family history they take. It's enough probably just to understand, early onset cancer, let's test. But, there needs to be probably more of a broader look in theory. But it's the way that things are going. But I would just love for people to understand that there are genetic counsellors out there available, be it on the telephone, or even the labs that are doing the testing can likely provide it if you're not getting the answer from your physician, who will likely refer you anyway to a genetic specialist if if something comes up, or if they're not sure that a negative result is, they should still be doing something if they have a negative result, such as extra breast screening if they've got a strong family history, etc.
Yeah, definitely. And there's so much trepidation. I think you have a very large part of the population, especially nowadays, that wants to know everything, that are wearing Oura rings and have on their Apple, on their phones, and they want to know everything going on in their bodies at all times, and how much they slept and what their resting heart rate is. I mean, they want to know every single piece of information. And then you have a huge part of the population wants to know nothing.
Yep.
They just want to live their life and go through it, and whatever happens, happens.
Yep.
And then there's, I guess, a big part that falls somewhere in between.
I mean, I've found most people are very happy with gaining information, but we definitely have patients who are like, oh, I don't want to know that. I want to know the minimum, which is fine. But a lot of people are very open to these more tests because information's power. I want to know more. But you still have to address the people that aren't okay with that as well,
Yep.
and how hard it is within the family. It breaks my heart when I hear that, like a cousin had a mutation tested for years ago and didn't tell the side of the family until they got ovarian cancer. It's happened. And I'm like, oh, this just upsets you so deeply that you just didn't
Siblings,
share the information.
Yeah, yeah. And also that sense of, I mean, knowing beforehand, if you're going to go through testing and you're going to meet with a genetic counselor, making some sort of decision beforehand within yourself. If I'm going to go down this road, what am I going to do with the information? And I even remember for myself, I think it was my second child, I was going to have an amnio, and I had what was it called? I had a weird thing with my pregnancy. No. And I remember I was living overseas, and a friend's dad is a doctor. And I asked him, I said, well, should I have an amnio? And he said, only if you're going to do something about the pregnancy, if you get information that is less than optimal. Otherwise, don't, because you have to fly overseas and the whole 9 yards. And I was like, oh, I have to really think about that. And so that stuck with me my whole, he's now 17 years old, but it stuck with me because I was like, there's some information that you sort of have to decide ahead of time. What am I going to do with that information once I get it? Because if I'm not really going to do anything with it, then what am I going to do? And who am I going to tell? And then I have to sit on it and hold it in. And it's going to affect more than me. So I don't know. I have seen that too.
Yeah, no, well, that comes into play a lot. So there's a syndrome called Lynch syndrome that people, it's actually more common than hereditary breast ovarian cancer, which is mutations in the BRCA1 and 2 genes, that it does predispose to uterus cancer, ovarian cancer, colorectal cancer mainly. There are 5 genes, and depending on the gene, there can be less or more risks. But we're finding more patients are being identified with these through panel results, which is considered a good thing, right? But then some of these, we're literally finding, you would look on paper and you never would have added those genes if you didn't. So there's that side of it that we're probably catching some people that we wouldn't have done before. But then, as you said, it's like, what are we going to do with information? Like if there's, and honestly, some of these panels, and I've been doing this for over 20 years, the genes on there I haven't heard of, and I thought I was pretty up to date. I'm pretty up to date with things, and it's a lot of that's kind of, they're probably researching the gene, which eventually might come to do something. But as long as they're aware that that's out there, and if something comes up inconclusive, it could change in the future. It could go up to be more significant. It could go down as benign. So things like that can change. What you were talking about with what we do with the information is when I speak to the younger adults, like kids 18 to 25 or even up to 35 who haven't yet had their children or planning on it, etc. It's like, okay, there is this mutation in a gene that predisposes you to breast cancer. We'll say there's a gene called ATM. So let's use the ATM gene. The ATM gene provides an increased risk for breast and pancreas cancer, but later than the BRCA genes. So if a 19-year-old comes and says, oh, mum's got an ATM mutation and I'd like to test for it, it's like, okay, we could test you for the mutation, but what are you going to do with that now? When you're at high school, you're at college, you've got to live life. There's not, again, I can never say that you're never going to develop breast cancer, but it's not a fully penetrant gene. You're not destined to get breast cancer or other cancers linked. So you just think about it. Think about how you'll sit with that. And come back to us in a couple of years if you want to sit on it. That's okay. And, make sure the doctors are on the same loop as well. And there can be, there can be different layers to that depending on the family. But generally, that's the discussion I have with the younger ones if it's not at the right time. And even for BRCA, and again, individually, but, you're not going to be doing breast mammograms before 30. You
Right.
might do MRIs, but in a 20-year-old, what do you do? And sometimes that comes down to like, family history, and the team works together. We work very closely with our colleagues in the breast team and figure out individually what that person has to do. But if you're going to sit on a result because you don't need to have anything done for 10 years, how's that going to be for you for exactly what you sort of said? And sure, we'll
Yeah.
and I say now, like, I don't want someone to test outside of a genetic counselor. If, because back in the day, we'd say, no, not going to test you, or a mother who just gave birth to a child who's got like a, say, BRCA mutation. I want to test my child, right? And it's like, no, no, there's no need to test the child. Nothing. It's their autonomy when they get older. But as a parent, it's hard, and we were very strong about that. And I think we'll be strong about that now. And that's a sort of a what am I trying to say? It's sort of an extreme example. But look, anyone can get testing. If you want to get testing, obviously you spit in a cup and you find a lab that does testing. But what we like to know is that you're testing at a good lab that's CLIA certified. We recognize it. We've had some reports from labs we've never heard of before. We're not sure. These direct-to-consumer labs that they're allowed to report just the AJ, Ashkenazi Jewish BRCA mutations, right? But they're not allowed to do I don't think there's many other genes they're allowed to report out. So people have to understand that that's all they're getting. They're not, just because that's negative, it doesn't mean they've had a full screen for that if it's indicated. Additionally, with a lot of these direct-to-consumers, I'm preparing a presentation, so it's in the forefront of my mind, is that a lot of patients are trying to get what we call the raw data from these direct-to-consumers, so they can go to these programs out there and comes up with, it's gobbledygoosh, but it looks like when they read this report, oh my gosh, I've got 2 BRCA mutations and I've got 2 BRCA2 mutations. Like, it's because they're reading it and they think, they don't know how to interpret it. And then they bring it to us and we're like, no, like let's test you clinically in a clinical lab. So, but it's going to happen, and we're not going to make you feel bad for doing it.
It kills me. It kills me.
Yeah.
I hate that. Makes me so upset.
Yeah. It's out of context. It's just, it is. I do think knowledge is power, but everyone's not that way. And it's everyone's choice, and we'll respect that. But I think it's all about informed choice. And if it's not going to come pre-test, which again is likely what's happening in the future, and some people will ask for it or be offered for it, but some people will just do it, we will still see you regardless. We don't take it against you if you've done your own testing, or anything like that. We're there for you. And I mean, I want to do some local community presentations where I am in New Jersey to the doctors to get them to have a better understanding of what they're ordering and testing. Because I had a gynecologist tell one of my patients that Lynch syndrome wasn't linked with uterus cancer, was linked with breast cancer, which is like, no. And it was a gynecologist. So I'm like, that's where it's misinformation and social media not helping.
It's educating everybody. It's educating the medical community. It's educating everybody. It's educating men, women, and everyone. And that's really important. So it is part of your job.
And also, if you don't know, you don't know, and you're better off saying that than saying something to someone. Because when I spoke to this particular patient, we'd spoken before, and I ended up getting her appointment pushed up because of that interaction. Because although this ultrasound looked negative, I showed it to a doctor. I'm like, well, you shouldn't be told that. No, you need to go and meet with the doctor and be told the right information. But and look, it's not everyone, and it's not. Doctors are amazing. Don't get me wrong, but as you know, genetics
not
is
all
niche,
of them are. Yeah.
Yeah, and they don't know why they're ordering testing, or a lot of the time when they're ordering the tumor panels, it's they don't have time to determine is it familial or not, and that's where we come in and work as a team. When do you see a genetic counselor when you get a tumor test? And that's another thing we're trying to figure out, because there's going to be a lot of these tumor analyses done, which is so much for the benefit of the patient, as I said, for targeted therapies, etc. But there's also, depending on the test, and most labs do not split off the germline result to the somatic. So you need to figure out, is there a familial mutation? And that's what we do. We investigate and we look and we get the reports, and we test clinically if need be, and do all of that.
Well, that's amazing. Thank you so much. I think it's women in particular, because that's my area of expertise, is being their own best advocate, which includes putting a team together who are knowledgeable and will get them through any sort of process from, if they're healthy all the way, God forbid, if they're not, to helping them find the right results and working with the best team possible. And you're incredible. You're so knowledgeable. And we're so grateful that you took the time to talk to us. Obviously, I could sit and talk to you for hours and hours.
I know. I feel like I could talk to you forever too. But importantly, to your point about advocacy, that's a really, did want to touch on that because I become very interested in that because I'm noticing a lot of doctors don't understand that what they see every day is like, oh, fine. Yet if that patient's seen them and there's a like a nodule and they hear nodule and the doctor's like da, 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 and they don't understand that's what does that mean, and they get nervous and don't ask the questions. So my big thing to people, I say, even my friends and anyone I'm talking to, is write down any questions you have. The doctor's there for you. You're not going to bother them. You're not affecting them. You have to know if you're concerned about what they said, try and see if it was framed differently or you heard it differently. That happens all the time. Never assume. This is a big thing. And never assume your genetic report got to the doctor. I would always keep copies of everything. Take everything with you. The resources are there for you. Ask for them if you're not given them, but definitely advocate for yourself. You know your body, your what's wrong for you. In, like they say with ovarian cancer, it's not a silent disease, it's subtle. And you know what's wrong for your body. So anything that's unusual after 3 weeks, because again, it's not laughable, that's the wrong word. But when you look at the signs for ovarian cancer, every woman has had issues of constipation, diarrhea, bloating, pains. It's like, oh my gosh. But if that continues more than what's normal, push for the doctor. You have to know and push for it.
And if that doctor tells you there's nothing wrong, then leave and go see someone else.
Exactly. 100%. Absolutely.
100%. I just had coffee 2 weeks ago with this incredible woman. I mean, she is so smart and so successful. And she spent 1.5 years with a doctor who told her there was nothing wrong. And she has stage 4 ovarian cancer. And it is just heartbreaking. And I had to hold myself back and say, what the hell were you doing? And, there's a diploma on the wall, and there's someone who is seemingly knows you and has looked at you and has checked you out and is telling you there's nothing wrong, and there is something wrong. You got to get up and leave. You just have to. It's so hard. But no one's going to do it for you.
Questions to ask, right? I've guided so many of my friends now and said, no, I'm not a doctor, but you're being run around, these doctors, because we're not getting an answer. Let me speak to someone, and you've got to know the right questions to ask but also don't be afraid to ask them. There's no silly question. There's no
when it comes to your own body and your health. No.
Yeah,
and when you know something, when something's wrong. When you're being a little crazy, but you also know when something is fundamentally wrong.
Absolutely.
And you can't take no for an answer. You just can't.
Yeah.
So,
exactly.
And if you are being crazy, who the hell cares? I mean, who cares?
Exactly. But honestly, push, call if you don't. And no, also never assume when you're calling to make an appointment that someone got the message. Call every day. Don't assume anything.
Never. Well, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. I really appreciate this. We will definitely talk again. Angela, you're amazing. Thank you so much. I'm so happy we have this connection. Julie is the best for putting us together. Thank you so much.